You're one of 80,000 soldiers trapped on a blood-soaked peninsula, surrounded by enemy forces who've watched your every move for 8 brutal months. Your commanders have just ordered a complete evacuation, but there's a problem. The moment the enemy realizes you're leaving, they'll unleash hell. Military experts predict 30,000 casualties during the retreat, 30,000 men who won't make it home. But then, a young lance corporal named William Scurry has an idea that sounds absolutely crazy. He wants to rig rifles to fire themselves using nothing but old food cans, some water and pieces of string. His superiors think he's lost his mind. Yet this seemingly absurd contraption, cobbled together from garbage and ingenuity, is about to pull off one of the most brilliant deceptions in military history and save the lives of thousands of men. This is the true story of the drip rifle, and how 2 soldiers armed with creativity turned certain disaster into one of warfare's greatest escapes. The year was 1915, and the Gallipoli Peninsula had become a graveyard. The campaign, launched with such confidence and ambition back in April, had turned into an absolute nightmare. The strategic goal had been simple on paper: land forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula, push through, capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. It would be quick, they said. It would be decisive, they said. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed was 8 months of some of the most brutal trench warfare the world had ever seen. Men lived like rats in narrow trenches carved into rocky hillsides. The summer heat was unbearable, cooking soldiers alive in their uniforms while clouds of flies swarmed over everything, drawn by the countless bodies that lay rotting in no man's land. Disease ran rampant through the trenches. Dysentery, typhoid and other illnesses cut down men just as effectively as Turkish bullets. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of death, human waste, and the acrid smoke of constant artillery fire. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, known as the Anzac Forces, had landed at what would become known as Anzac Cove. From the moment their boats hit the beach, they were under withering fire from Turkish positions in the hills above. The beach approach was supposed to be relatively easy terrain. Instead, the troops found themselves facing steep cliffs and entrenched defenders with perfect fields of fire. The casualties were staggering. Young men who'd never seen combat before were cut down before they even made it off the beach. Those who survived the initial landing found themselves pinned down, unable to advance more than a few hundred yards from the shoreline. For months, the pattern repeated itself. Attacks were launched with great bravery and determination. Men went over the top, charging across open ground toward Turkish positions. Most never made it. The ground was so contested, so thoroughly covered by machine gun fire, that retrieving the wounded was nearly impossible. Soldiers who fell between the lines often died slowly, crying out for help that couldn't reach them. The psychological toll was immense. The Anzacs were tough men, farmers and labourers, and stockmen from the Australian outback and New Zealand countryside. But no amount of toughness prepared anyone for this. They watched friends die in horrible ways. They lived in constant fear of the next artillery barrage, the next sniper's bullet, the next futile charge ordered by commanders who seemed disconnected from the reality on the ground. By October, even the most optimistic officers had to admit the truth. The campaign was a failure. They weren't going to break through. They weren't going to capture Constantinople. They were simply dying in droves for no strategic gain whatsoever. General Ian Hamilton, who'd commanded the operation, was sacked and replaced with General Charles Monro. Monro took one look at the situation and delivered a blunt assessment: evacuate. Get the men out before winter arrives and makes everything even worse. But here's where the problem became truly terrifying. 80,000 men were spread across the peninsula in various positions. The Turks had spent months learning the layout of every Allied trench, every supply route, every defensive position. They had the high ground. They had artillery zeroed in on all the key locations. And they were watching, constantly watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, any opportunity to attack. If the Turks realized the Allies were evacuating, they could turn the retreat into a massacre. Men would be caught in the open, scrambling down to the beaches, while Turkish artillery and machine guns tore them apart. The narrow beaches would become killing zones. The prediction of 30,000 casualties wasn't pessimism. It was a realistic assessment based on the tactical situation. The evacuation needed to be executed with absolute perfection. Every detail mattered. The planning began in secret, with only the highest-ranking officers aware of the true intention. Throughout November, the Allied forces began implementing what they called silent stunts, strange periods where all firing would cease from their lines. The purpose was psychological warfare. They wanted the Turks to think the Allies were settling in for the winter, going quiet as they prepared for the cold months ahead. It was the opposite of the truth, but it needed to be believable. Supplies were gradually reduced. Artillery pieces were slowly withdrawn, moved at night to minimize detection. Every night, a portion of the troops would make their way down to the beaches and board ships, while the remaining men spread out to cover more ground, maintaining the appearance of normal trench strength. It was exhausting work. The men left behind had to make it seem like the entire force was still present. They'd pop up here and there, fire off a few shots, move to another position and do it again, creating the illusion of a fully manned defensive line. But as the evacuation progressed and the numbers dwindled, a critical problem emerged. In the final phase, when the last couple thousand men made their escape, who would maintain the illusion? If the firing suddenly stopped completely, the Turks would know immediately. They'd launch an attack, potentially catching the rearguard, still making their way to the beaches. Some kind of solution was needed, a way to keep rifles firing, even after the last human defender had left the trenches. This is where Lance Corporal William Charles Scurry enters our story. Scurry was 20 years old, a private soldier from Melbourne who'd enlisted the moment war broke out. He came from a family of architectural modelers, craftsmen who built detailed scale models of buildings. This background gave him a particular way of thinking about problems. He was used to figuring out how things worked, how mechanisms could be created to achieve specific purposes. He'd already been promoted to Lance Corporal, showing promise as a soldier, but more importantly, he had a creative mind. Scurry had a friend, Private Alfred Lawrence, who everyone called Bunty. The two of them spent their spare time, what little of it existed in the trenches, discussing the evacuation problem. How do you make a rifle fire itself? The answer couldn't be complicated. It had to be simple, reliable, and built from materials readily available in a military camp. They had no access to fancy clockwork mechanisms or electrical systems. They had rifles, ammunition, and whatever random supplies were lying around. The solution came from an unlikely source, their daily rations. Soldiers at Gallipoli received their food in tin cans. Bully beef, jam, kerosene, water, everything came in these simple metal containers. After the contents were consumed, the cans were usually just discarded or sometimes repurposed for other needs. Scurry looked at these cans and saw potential. The idea was elegantly simple. Take 2 cans, fill the top one with water, hang it above an empty can. Connect the lower can to the trigger of a rifle using string or wire. Punch a small hole in the bottom of the upper can. Water would drip slowly from the top can into the bottom can. As the bottom can filled with water, it would become heavier. Eventually, it would be heavy enough to pull the trigger string, firing the rifle. The beauty of the design was its simplicity. Water drips at a predictable rate. By controlling the size of the hole in the upper can, you could control how long it would take for the rifle to fire. Make the hole smaller, and the rifle might not fire for 20 or 30 minutes. Make it slightly larger, and it could fire in 10 minutes. Set up multiple rifles with different timing, and you could create a pattern of sporadic fire that would sound exactly like nervous soldiers, taking occasional shots at suspicious movements. Scurry and Lawrence built their first prototype, They requisitioned a rifle, some old ration cans, and some string. The setup process was straightforward. First, you'd find a good firing position in the trench, ideally somewhere with sandbags for support. You'd load the rifle and secure it pointing toward enemy lines. Then you'd set up the can apparatus above it. The top can, full of water, would be suspended somehow, maybe hung from a piece of wood or propped on sandbags. The bottom can would be positioned below it, connected to the trigger. At the last possible moment, just before abandoning the position, a soldier would punch a hole in the bottom of the upper can. Then, he'd get the hell out of there, making his way to the evacuation boats. Behind him, water would start its slow drip. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop falling into the lower can, adding fractionally to its weight. The rifle would sit there, waiting, an automated sentinel that required no human hand. They tested the design. It worked. The rifle fired exactly as predicted. Scurry reported his invention up the chain of command. In normal circumstances, a lance corporal's oddball contraption might have been dismissed out of hand. But these weren't normal circumstances. The officers in charge of evacuation planning were desperate for any advantage, any tool that might help them pull off this incredibly dangerous operation. They saw the genius in Scurry's design immediately. This could work. This could actually work. The device was given an official name, the drip rifle. Some soldiers called it the pop-off rifle because of the way it would suddenly pop off a shot with no warning. Scurry and Lawrence were instructed to build more of them. They weren't alone in their ingenuity, though. Other soldiers came up with variations on the same basic idea. Some used candles instead of water. They'd run the trigger string through a lit candle positioned so the flame would slowly burn through the string. When the string burned through completely, the tension would release and the trigger would pull. The candle method was less predictable than the water drip method because candles burned at different rates depending on wind and other factors. But it worked as a backup option, another way to keep up the deception. The final evacuation date was set. The last troops would leave before dawn on December 20th, 1915. The night before, as darkness fell over the peninsula, the remaining men prepared to abandon positions they'd held for 8 brutal months. The mood was strange, a mixture of relief and guilt. They were getting out alive, escaping this nightmare. But they were leaving behind the graves of thousands of friends and comrades. The ground they'd fought so hard for, died for, would be given up without a fight. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the drip rifles were prepared. 6 of them were set up at carefully chosen positions along the 3rd Brigade section of the line. Each one was loaded, aimed, and ready. The water cans were filled. Everything was checked and double-checked. The timing had to be perfect. The rifles needed to start firing after the men had cleared the immediate area, but not so late that the Turks could figure out what was happening and pursue. The last soldiers moved through the trenches one final time. They looked back at the positions they were abandoning, at the crude shelters that had been home, at the firing steps where they'd spent countless hours watching the enemy lines. Then they turned and headed down to the beaches. Their footsteps were carefully muffled. Every man knew that noise discipline could mean the difference between life and death. One loud sound, one clanking canteen or dropped rifle could alert Turkish sentries. Down at the beaches, boats waited in the darkness. The evacuation was proceeding with remarkable efficiency. Men filed aboard, boat after boat filling up and pulling away, heading out to the larger ships waiting offshore. The organization was impressive, a stark contrast to the chaos that had characterized so much of the campaign. This, at least, was being done right. Back in the trenches, the water dripped. Invisible in the darkness, impossible to hear over the normal sounds of night, the mechanism worked exactly as designed. Drip, drip, drip. The weight in the lower cans increased gradually, gram by gram. The strings connected to the triggers grew taut. The rifles waited. Across no man's land, Turkish soldiers maintained their watch. They'd grown used to the rhythms of the Allied positions. Occasional shots, periods of quiet, then more shots. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that anything had changed. The last boat pulled away from Anzac Cove at 3:45 in the morning. 80,000 men had been evacuated. They were gone, heading to safety, heading home eventually. The trenches stood empty, abandoned, haunted by the ghosts of all who died there. And then, in the pre-dawn darkness, a rifle fired. A single shot cracked out across no man's land. The Turkish forces would have tensed, wondering if it was the start of another attack. But no attack came, just that one shot echoing in the darkness. Then silence. Then, several minutes later, another shot from a different position. Then another. The drip rifles were doing their job. The pattern continued for about 20 minutes after the last men departed. Random shots from various points along the line, creating the perfect impression of nervous sentries keeping watch. By the time the Turkish forces realized something was wrong, by the time they cautiously advanced to investigate the Allied positions, it was far too late. The trenches were empty. The supplies that couldn't be evacuated had been destroyed. The Allies were gone. The evacuation, which should have been a catastrophe, had been pulled off with almost no casualties. In fact, the entire operation resulted in only a handful of losses. It was, arguably, the only completely successful operation of the entire Gallipoli campaign. The drip rifle had played a crucial role. Those 6 simple devices, built from garbage and ingenuity, had bought the precious time needed for the last men to escape. They'd maintained the deception just long enough. William Scurry's brilliant improvisation had saved countless lives. The military recognized this. Scurry was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his invention, a significant honor for such a young soldier. His friend Lawrence received recognition as well. But the story doesn't end there. Scurry's military service continued. He'd proven himself not just as an inventor, but as a capable soldier. After Gallipoli, he shipped to France to fight on the Western Front. There he was commissioned as an officer, a remarkable achievement for someone who'd started the war as a private. He was given command of the 15th Light Trench Mortar Battery, a position of significant responsibility. He earned the Military Cross for his leadership, continuing to distinguish himself in combat. However, in 1916, tragedy struck. Scurry was inspecting a new type of fuse on an unexploded bomb when it detonated. The explosion was devastating. He lost the sight in one eye. His right index finger was blown off. For most men, such injuries would have ended their military career immediately. But Scurry refused to quit. Despite his wounds, despite being partially blinded, he insisted on continuing to serve. He became an instructor at the 1st Anzac Corps School, teaching other soldiers the skills they'd need to survive at the front. His determination and expertise were valued enough that he was eventually allowed to return to frontline service in 1918, seeing the war through to its end. After the armistice, Scurry returned to Australia. He married Doris Barry, a nurse he'd met in France, and they had 4 children. He tried to build a normal civilian life, working first in his father's architectural modeling business, then trying his hand at orcharding. But his war injuries continued to plague him. The damage to his eye and hand made detailed work increasingly difficult. Eventually, he was forced to retire due to his disability. When the Second World War broke out, Scurry, now in his mid-40s and carrying the scars of the First War, volunteered again. He served on home defense duties, commanding an internment camp. Even in middle age, partially disabled, he felt the need to serve. He survived the Second War and lived until 1963, dying at the age of 68. The drip rifle itself became a legend. Specimens were preserved in military museums. The device represented something important, the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary circumstances. It showed that sometimes the simplest solutions, the ones that don't require advanced technology or massive resources, can be the most effective. It demonstrated that creative thinking could overcome tactical challenges that seemed insurmountable. The device has been studied by military historians as an example of effective deception operations. It's taught in some military academies as a case study in improvisation and problem-solving under pressure. Think about what Scurry and Lawrence accomplished. They were just two regular soldiers, not engineers or scientists, not high-ranking officers with access to research and development teams. They saw a problem, applied creative thinking, and came up with a solution using literal garbage. And that solution worked so well that it helped save thousands of lives and contributed to one of the most successful military evacuations in history. That's the power of human ingenuity when it's really needed. The broader lesson of the drip rifle extends beyond military tactics. It's about not being limited by the resources you have available. It's about looking at problems from different angles, being willing to try unconventional solutions, and not dismissing ideas just because they seem too simple or too strange. How many times in your own life have you faced a situation where the conventional approach wasn't working? How often have you needed to improvise, to make do with what you had, rather than what you wished you had? That's the spirit of the drip rifle. The Gallipoli campaign itself remains one of the most studied military operations in history. It's taught as an example of how not to conduct an amphibious assault, how poor planning and unrealistic expectations can lead to disaster. But within that larger failure, there were moments of incredible courage, determination, and yes, ingenuity. The drip rifle represents the best of what soldiers can achieve when they're forced to think creatively. It's a reminder that technology and resources matter, but human cleverness matters just as much, maybe more. Today, when we think about World War I, we often focus on the big picture, the massive armies, the industrial-scale slaughter, the political and social changes the war brought about. But wars are fought by individual human beings, each with their own stories, their own moments of fear and courage, their own contributions to the larger effort. William Scurry was just one young man from Melbourne, but his simple invention had an outsized impact on the course of events. How many other soldiers made similar contributions that weren't recognized or recorded? How many clever solutions were implemented in trenches around the world, helping men survive against terrible odds? The drip rifle also reminds us that warfare isn't just about firepower and manpower. It's about deception, psychology, and understanding your enemy's expectations. The Turkish forces at Gallipoli were excellent soldiers fighting on their home territory. They'd proven themselves repeatedly against Allied attacks, but they were deceived by something as simple as rifles that fired themselves, because the deception played into their existing understanding of how the battlefield worked. They heard shots and assumed men were firing them. That assumption, that failure to imagine an alternative explanation, gave the Allies the time they needed to escape. In modern warfare, the principles that made the drip rifle effective are still relevant. Military operations still rely heavily on deception and misdirection. Fake tank formations, electronic warfare systems that create phantom aircraft on radar, all of these are descendants of the same basic idea: make your enemy think you're doing one thing while actually doing another. The technology has advanced dramatically, but the underlying psychology remains the same. The drip rifle was a low-tech predecessor to all the sophisticated deception systems used by modern militaries. There's something poignant about the image of those rifles firing into the darkness, their mechanical triggers pulled by the weight of water collected drop by drop. They were the last soldiers of Anzac Cove, standing watch after their human comrades had departed. They maintained the illusion of presence in the face of absence, sound in the place of silence. And then, their job done, they fell silent themselves, left behind like everything else that couldn't be carried away. Some of those rifles might still be there, rusted and buried, physical artifacts of a moment when simple ingenuity triumphed over complex problems. The story of the drip rifle deserves to be remembered, not just as a curious footnote to military history, but as an inspiring example of human creativity under pressure. It shows us that the most important weapon a soldier can carry isn't their rifle or their training, although both are crucial. It's their ability to think, to adapt, to find solutions when the situation seems hopeless. William Scurry and Bunty Lawrence demonstrated that ability in the trenches of Gallipoli, and their invention helped bring 80,000 men home safely. As we reflect on their achievement, we should ask ourselves what problems we're facing that might have unconventional solutions. What resources do we have that we're not fully utilizing? What assumptions are we making that might be limiting our options? The next time you're confronted with a seemingly impossible challenge, remember the lance corporal who saved an army with tin cans and string. Remember that simple solutions can be powerful solutions. Remember that ingenuity and creativity are resources that never run out, no matter how dire the circumstances. The legacy of the drip rifle lives on in military museums, in history books, and in the collective memory of nations. But more importantly, it lives on in the principle it represents, that ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, can achieve extraordinary things. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing enemy fire in a trench or simply trying to solve the everyday problems that life throws at you. Creativity, determination, and the willingness to try something new can make all the difference between success and failure, between life and death. William Scurry knew that. The thousands of men who made it home from Gallipoli knew it too. And now you know it as well. Now I really want to hear from you. What do you think about this incredible story? Have you ever had to improvise a solution to a serious problem? What's the most creative fix you've ever come up with when you didn't have the right tools or resources? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want, tell me from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. But before you go, I need your help. We're trying to hit 100 comments on this video. That might not sound like much, but engagement like that tells YouTube that people care about this content, which means the algorithm will show it to more people who love history just like you do. If we can reach that goal, it proves there's an audience for these forgotten stories, and it motivates us to keep researching and producing more content like this. So please, take just 10 seconds to leave a comment. Tell me what you thought, ask a question, share a related story, anything. Your participation literally determines whether we can continue bringing you more inspiring historical stories like this one. Let's hit that 100-comment goal together, and don't forget to watch until the very end and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.